The vast emptiness of space stretched in all directions as Admiral Zex Thera stood on the bridge of his massive warship. The Imperial dreadnought Eternal Dominion was 3 kilometers long and packed with enough firepower to destroy entire planets. For 2,000 years, ships like this had kept the Galactic Empire in control of known space. Every species that encountered them either surrendered immediately or was crushed without mercy. Today felt like any other day of patrol duty along the outer rim. Zex Thera's forearms moved gracefully across the command console, while his scaled hide gleamed under the bridge lights. His species, the Vorthak, had been the Empire's military backbone for centuries. They were born warriors, bred for conquest and domination. Admiral, we're detecting primitive radio signals from the 3rd planet of this system, reported his communications officer. The young Vorthak's voice carried the excitement of discovering new prey. Zex Thera examined the data flowing across his screens. The signals were crude and unencrypted, clearly from a species that had barely begun to explore space. Perfect for harvesting. The Empire always needed more slave species to work in the deep mines and factory worlds. Any signs of space travel? Zex Thera asked. Minimal, sir. A few primitive satellites and what appears to be one small vessel approximately 12 light minutes from the planet. Zex Thera smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. Another easy conquest. The pattern was always the same. First came the discovery, then the demonstration of imperial power, followed by complete surrender. Within a few months, this species would be just another entry in the Empire's vast catalog of subject races. Set course for the vessel. Let's introduce ourselves to these humans. Meanwhile, Captain Jake Morrison floated in the cramped command center of humanity's first interstellar ship. The New Horizon was barely 200 meters long, built from repurposed military hardware and civilian technology. Every surface was covered with exposed wiring and jury-rigged equipment. The ship looked more like a flying scrapyard than a vessel of exploration, but Jake was proud of it. This rickety collection of metal and dreams represented humanity's first step toward the stars. His crew of 12 had volunteered for a 5-year mission to explore the nearest star systems. They carried messages of peace and samples of Earth's culture, hoping to make contact with other intelligent life. Captain, I'm reading something big on the sensors, called out Dr. Lisa Carter from her station. The ship's science officer was also its medical doctor, cook, and backup pilot. Everyone wore multiple hats on the New Horizon. Jake pushed himself over to her console and studied the readings. His heart stopped. The object approaching them was enormous, bigger than anything humanity had ever built. It was clearly artificial and moving with purpose. Tony, can you get a visual on that thing? Jake called to their engineer. Tony Rodriguez worked frantically at his station, trying to coax better performance from their aging sensors. Coming up on screen now, Captain. The image that appeared made everyone on the bridge fall silent. The alien ship was a monument to military power. Its dark hull bristled with weapon emplacements and sensor arrays. Strange lights pulsed along its length like a mechanical heartbeat. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. My God, whispered Kelly Brooks, their communications officer. We're really not alone. Jake forced himself to stay calm. This was the moment humanity had dreamed about for centuries. First contact with an alien civilization. He had trained for this, studied every possible scenario. But seeing that massive warship bearing down on them made his mouth go dry. Kelly, start broadcasting our greeting message on all frequencies. Let them know we come in peace. Kelly's fingers danced across her console, sending out the carefully prepared transmission. It began with basic mathematical sequences to establish intelligence, followed by simple pictographs showing Earth's location and humanity's peaceful intentions. The message had been crafted by Earth's best linguists and scientists. They waited in tense silence as the alien ship continued to approach. It was now close enough that they could see individual weapon turrets rotating in their direction. Jake realized with growing unease that those weapons were tracking the New Horizon. Incoming transmission. Captain, Kelly announced. Put it through. The voice that filled the bridge was cold and mechanical, translated by some kind of universal communication device. Primitive vessel, you will surrender immediately. Your species will submit to Imperial authority, or face destruction. This is your only warning. Jake felt his blood turn to ice. This wasn't the peaceful first contact humanity had hoped for. These aliens weren't explorers or diplomats. They were conquerors. Respond with our standard peaceful greeting. Make it clear we're not hostile, Jake ordered. Kelly sent the message, but the alien response came back even harsher than before. Your compliance is not requested. It is demanded. Prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will result in your immediate termination. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Jake looked around at his crew's faces. Dr. Carter was pale but determined. Tony's hands were already moving toward the engine controls. Kelly waited for orders with her finger hovering over the communication controls. Jake had spent his career in the space program dreaming of this moment. He had imagined shaking hands with alien ambassadors, sharing knowledge and culture, opening a new chapter in human history. He had never imagined this. Captain, Tony said quietly, I can give us full power. We might be able to outrun them. Jake shook his head. The alien ship was massive and clearly designed for war. The New Horizon was built for exploration, not combat. They would never escape. Kelly, open a channel. Channel open, sir. Jake took a deep breath and spoke clearly into the microphone. Alien vessel, this is Captain Jake Morrison of the human exploration ship New Horizon. We are peaceful explorers from Earth. We have no hostile intentions and pose no threat to you or your empire. We request safe passage to return to our homeworld. The response was immediate and final. Your request is denied. Submit or be destroyed. A brilliant flash lit up the New Horizon's hull as an energy beam struck their communication array. Sparks flew across Kelly's console as systems overloaded. The message was clear. Submit or die. Jake stared at the massive alien warship on his screen and made the most important decision in human history. His hand moved to the emergency beacon controls. This device was designed to send a compressed data burst back to Earth in case of catastrophic mission failure. It would tell humanity everything they had learned about their first alien contact. I'm sorry, Jake whispered, knowing that what he was about to do would change everything. He activated the beacon. The message that raced toward Earth was simple but devastating. We are not alone and they are not friendly. 3 months had passed since Jake Morrison's desperate message reached Earth, and the planet had changed completely. The emergency beacon signal had arrived at the worst possible time during a United Nations meeting about climate change. Within minutes of decoding the transmission, every world leader was staring at the same terrifying message on their screens. President Helen Martinez stood in the secure bunker beneath the White House, surrounded by screens showing military installations across the globe. The woman who had spent 4 years trying to bring peace to Earth now faced the task of preparing humanity for war against an enemy they knew almost nothing about. Status report, she commanded. General Ryan Patterson stepped forward with a tablet full of updates. The veteran soldier looked older than his 50 years, his gray hair reflecting the stress of the past 3 months. Protocol 7 is now fully active, Madam President. Every available resource has been redirected toward the Defense Initiative. Protocol 7 had been a theoretical plan, something military strategists had developed years ago as a joke. What would humanity do if hostile aliens arrived? The plan had gathered dust in classified files until Jake Morrison's message made it the most important. Document on Earth. Show me the numbers, Martinez said. Patterson swiped his tablet and the main screen lit up with data. We've converted 12 space stations into defensive platforms. The asteroid mining companies have retooled their equipment into kinetic weapon launchers. 300 commercial satellites have been weaponized with experimental technology. Martinez nodded, but her expression remained grim. What about the fleet? That's where things get interesting, ma'am. Across the solar system, humanity's response was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. While other species had responded to imperial threats by building bigger ships and more powerful weapons, humans had taken a completely different approach. Commander Amy Sullivan floated in the zero-gravity workshop of Luna Station, watching her team convert a luxury cruise ship into something the Empire had never encountered. The ocean breeze had once carried wealthy tourists on pleasure trips around the solar system. Now it bristled with experimental weapons and sensor equipment that defied conventional military thinking. Status on the drive modifications? Amy asked her chief engineer. Lieutenant Ben Foster looked up from his work on the ship's engines. The young man had been designing racing ships just 4 months ago. Now he was humanity's expert on high-speed combat maneuvering. We've tripled the acceleration capacity and added the new stealth coating. She won't show up on traditional sensors, Amy smiled. The Empire expected to fight other empires with massive fleets of heavily armed dreadnoughts. They had no idea how to handle swarms of small, fast ships that appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Dr. Marcus Webb worked in a different kind of laboratory on Earth, surrounded by holographic displays showing battle simulations. The military strategist had spent his career studying human conflicts from ancient warfare to modern terrorism. His job was to find patterns that could work against an alien empire. "Computer, run simulation 47 again," he commanded. The hologram showed a recreation of typical Imperial fleet tactics based on data recovered from the New Horizon incident. Massive ships formed orderly battle lines and advanced slowly, while firing devastating energy weapons. It was impressive and terrifying, but Webb saw something else in the patterns. "They're predictable," he muttered to himself. 2,000 years of easy victories made them lazy. His assistant, Dr. Rachel Torres, looked up from her own research. The xenopsychologist had been analyzing every scrap of data about Imperial culture that Jake Morrison's ship had recorded. "What do you mean?" "Look at their formation patterns. They always use the same approach. Heavy ships in front, support vessels behind, fighter screens on the flanks. It's textbook military doctrine, but it assumes your enemy will play by the same rules." Rachel nodded slowly. "And we won't, exactly. They expect us to build dreadnoughts and meet them in traditional fleet combat. Instead, we're going to give them something they've never seen before." Webb's strategy was revolutionary. Instead of trying to match Imperial firepower, humanity would use speed, unpredictability, and tactics that exploited the Empire's rigid military thinking. Every engagement would be fought on humanity's terms. Meanwhile, in the outer solar system, Captain Jake Morrison was very much alive despite Imperial assumptions. His crew had managed to repair the New Horizon enough to escape to a hidden asteroid base that human miners had carved out years before. The base was now humanity's forward command post and intelligence center. Jake stood in the base's main operations room, watching screens that showed Imperial scout ships moving through the solar system. Admiral Zexthara's forces were conducting what they assumed was routine reconnaissance, mapping human defenses before the main invasion fleet arrived. "They have no idea what they're looking at," said Dr. Lisa Carter. The New Horizons science officer had become humanity's expert on Imperial technology. Their sensors are designed to detect large metal structures and energy signatures. Our new defensive platforms don't match their search patterns. The Imperial scouts were looking for space stations and military bases that looked like their own. They couldn't recognize the converted mining platforms and disguised commercial facilities that now formed humanity's real defenses. To Imperial sensors, the solar system appeared to have minimal defenses and a primitive industrial base. Jake smiled grimly as he watched an Imperial scout ship pass within a few thousand kilometers of a hidden weapons platform. The aliens had no idea they were being watched and analyzed. Every scan they performed gave humanity more data about Imperial technology and tactics. "How long until the main fleet arrives?" Jake asked. His communications officer, Kelly Brooks, looked up from her station. "Based on their transmission patterns, approximately 3 more months. 3 months to finish preparations for the most important battle in human history." Jake knew the odds were impossible. The Empire had ships that could destroy planets and armies that had conquered hundreds of worlds. Humanity had never fought a space war and barely had enough ships to qualify as a fleet. But humans had something the Empire had never encountered. They had 3 months of pure desperation focused on a single goal. Every person on Earth and in the colonies was working toward the same objective. Scientists who had spent careers arguing with each other now collaborated freely. Military forces that had been enemies just months before shared technology and tactics. Most importantly, humanity wasn't trying to beat the Empire at their own game. They were changing the rules entirely. As Jake watched the Imperial scouts continue their reconnaissance, he thought about Admiral Zexthara's assumption that Earth had already surrendered. The Empire was used to species that either groveled immediately or fought conventional battles they were guaranteed to lose. They had never encountered a species that went quiet, analyzed their weaknesses, and then prepared a trap that would turn their greatest strengths against them. The countdown had begun, and humanity was ready to teach the galaxy that sometimes the smallest opponent can deliver the biggest surprise. 6 months after first contact, Admiral Zexthara finally arrived at the human home system with the Imperial Third Fleet. His armada consisted of 47 warships ranging from massive dreadnoughts to fast attack cruisers. Each vessel carried enough firepower to level a city, and together they represented the unstoppable might of the Galactic Empire. Zexathara stood on his command bridge studying the tactical displays with growing confusion. The system appeared completely empty of life. No radio transmissions filled the communication channels. No spacecraft moved between the planets. Even the primitive satellites that his scouts had reported were now silent and dark. "Sub-Commander Veltar, what do your sensors show?" Zexathara asked his tactical officer. The younger Vorthak's scales rippled with uncertainty as he checked his readings. "The third planet shows no signs of industrial activity, Admiral. No energy signatures, no manufacturing centers, no population centers broadcasting signals. It appears the humans have simply vanished." Zexathara nodded with satisfaction. This was a common response when primitive species encountered imperial power. Faced with inevitable conquest, many civilizations simply collapsed and scattered. The survivors usually hid in caves or remote locations until imperial forces rounded them up for processing. "Move the fleet into standard orbital bombardment formation," Zexathara ordered. "We'll conduct a thorough surface scan and locate any remaining population centers." The massive imperial ships moved with practiced precision into position around Earth. Each vessel took up a predetermined location that would allow them to target any point on the planet's surface within minutes. It was a formation that had been used successfully on hundreds of worlds. But something felt wrong to Sub-Commander Veltar. His years of combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was screaming danger. "Admiral, I'm detecting unusual readings from the asteroid belt." Zexathara glanced at the secondary displays. "Define unusual." "The debris patterns seem too organized, sir. The spacing between objects is too regular for a natural formation. Probably the remains of their primitive mining operations." Zexathara dismissed the concern. These humans were barely capable of spaceflight. They certainly couldn't pose a threat to Imperial warships. Hidden throughout the solar system, humanity's real defenses watched and waited. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the operation from a concealed base built inside a hollowed-out asteroid. His small command center was connected to a network of sensors and communication relays that gave him a complete picture of Imperial fleet movements. "All stations report ready," announced. His tactical officer, Linda Hayes, the former prisoner of war specialist, had joined Jake's team after the New Horizon incident, bringing years of experience in resistance operations. "The Empire has taken the bait perfectly." Jake studied the holographic display showing Imperial ship positions. Admiral Zexathara had deployed his fleet exactly as human strategists had predicted. The aliens were following standard Imperial doctrine, which made them predictable and vulnerable. "Stephen, are you ready with the communications hack?" Jake asked. Stephen Clark looked up from his bank of computers. The former civilian hacker had become humanity's expert on Imperial communication systems after months of studying captured data. "I've got access to their tactical network. When you give the word, I can broadcast on all Imperial frequencies simultaneously. And Carlos, how are our surprise packages?" Carlos Mendez grinned from his demolition station. The explosives expert had spent months converting mining charges into something far more destructive. "Every platform is loaded and ready, Captain. The Empire won't know what hit them." The Imperial fleet continued its methodical approach to Earth, completely unaware that they were moving into the most sophisticated trap in human history. Admiral Zexathara expected to find either ruins or a terrified population ready to surrender. Instead, he was about to encounter humanity's greatest strength, the ability to turn their enemies' assumptions against them. "Admiral, we're now in optimal bombardment position," reported Veltar. "All ships report ready to begin surface operations." Zexathara was about to give the order when something extraordinary happened. Every screen on every Imperial ship suddenly displayed the same image. Captain Jake Morrison sitting calmly in what appeared to be a military command center. "Greetings, Admiral Zexathara." Jake's voice filled the bridge of the Imperial flagship. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Zexathara's forearms moved frantically across his controls as he tried to cut the transmission. "Communications, how are they accessing our networks?" "Unknown, sir. The signal is coming from multiple sources throughout the system." "I cannot block it." Jake continued speaking with the calm confidence of someone holding all the cards. 6 months ago, you demanded our surrender and fired on our peaceful exploration vessel. You assumed that humanity would either grovel at your feet or simply disappear when faced with Imperial might. You were wrong on both counts. The Admiral's tactical display suddenly lit up with new contacts. Objects that had appeared to be asteroids were now revealing themselves as massive weapons platforms. Mining stations that his scouts had dismissed as abandoned were powering up energy weapons. Even the debris in the asteroid belt was moving with purpose and intelligence. "Welcome to our neighborhood, Admiral," Jake announced as thousands of defensive platforms came online throughout the solar system. "You wanted to meet humanity? Now you're going to learn what makes us different from every other species you've conquered." Veltar stared at his sensors in disbelief. "Admiral, I'm reading over 3,000 individual contacts. They're everywhere. The entire system is one massive defensive network." But the true genius of humanity's trap wasn't just the hidden weapons. As the Imperial fleet tried to process this new tactical situation, they discovered that their own ships were betraying them. The communication hack that Stephen Clark had implemented wasn't just for broadcasting messages. It had given humanity access to Imperial navigation systems, weapon targeting computers, and even life support controls. "Admiral," called out the Imperial communications officer, "our ships are receiving conflicting orders. Someone is accessing our command protocols." Admiral Zexathera realized with growing horror that he had led his entire fleet into a carefully planned ambush. These humans hadn't fled or surrendered. They had spent 6 months studying Imperial weaknesses and preparing a trap that turned the Empire's greatest strength into a vulnerability. The massive Imperial dreadnoughts that had conquered hundreds of worlds were now sitting motionless in space, surrounded by thousands of hidden weapons and compromised by their own communication systems. For the first time in his military career, Admiral Zexathera faced an enemy that had completely outmaneuvered him. "Sub-Commander, signal the fleet to withdraw immediately," Zexathera ordered. "I cannot, sir. Our communication systems are compromised. Half our ships are not responding to orders." Jake Morrison's voice filled the bridge once more. "Admiral, before you consider your next move, let me explain something about human nature. We don't like bullies, and we really don't like being threatened. You came here expecting easy prey. Instead, you found predators. The trap was complete, and humanity was ready to teach the Galactic Empire that sometimes the smallest species can deliver the biggest surprise." The Battle of Earth began with something the galaxy had never seen before. Instead of massive capital ships firing energy beams at each other, thousands of tiny automated fighters swarmed out of hidden asteroid bases like angry hornets. Each fighter was no bigger than a car and looked more like a child's toy than a weapon of war. Admiral Zexathara watched in confusion as these miniature craft approached his mighty dreadnoughts. "What are those things?" he demanded from his tactical officer. Sub-Commander Veltar studied his sensors with growing alarm. "They appear to be unmanned fighters, Admiral, but there are thousands of them, and they're not following any recognizable attack pattern." The Imperial fleet opened fire with their massive energy cannons, designed to destroy other capital ships. The beams tore through space and vaporized dozens of the small human fighters, but more kept coming. For every fighter destroyed, 2 more appeared to take its place. But these weren't ordinary fighters. Each one was controlled by gaming artificial intelligence systems that had been adapted for combat. The computers that had once helped humans play video games now guided weapons that moved like nothing the Empire had ever encountered. Captain Sarah Mitchell led Wolfpack Squadron from the bridge of her converted freight hauler. The Lucky Strike had once carried cargo between Earth and Mars. Now it bristled with experimental weapons and moved through space with the grace of a dancer. "Nick, take your wing and hit their communication arrays," Sarah commanded her wingman. Nick Carter rolled his modified racing ship through a series of maneuvers that would have been impossible for Imperial pilots. His vessel had been built for speed races around Jupiter's moons. But human engineers had added weapons that could punch through heavy armor. "Copy that, Sarah. Pete, you're with me." Pete Johnson followed in his own converted ship, grinning as he dove toward the massive Imperial dreadnought. The former commercial pilot had hauled passengers between space stations for 15 years. Now he was using his knowledge of civilian spacecraft to confuse Imperial targeting systems. The genius of humanity's strategy became clear as the battle developed. While Imperial ships expected to fight other warships, they faced swarms of small craft that attacked critical systems, instead of trying to destroy entire vessels. Human fighters targeted communication dishes, sensor arrays, and weapon control systems rather than attempting to penetrate heavy armor. Admiral Zexthera found his flagship under assault from dozens of tiny craft that his weapons couldn't effectively target. The massive guns designed to destroy other dreadnoughts were useless against fighters that moved like insects and struck like surgical instruments. Damage. Report, he ordered. We've lost primary communications, long-range sensors, and 40% of our weapon systems, replied his engineering officer. The hull is intact, but we're effectively blind and nearly defenseless. Across the Imperial fleet, the same story was playing out on ship after ship. Humanity had studied Imperial weaknesses for 6 months and designed their attack to exploit every vulnerability. Instead of trying to match Imperial firepower, they had made it irrelevant. But the real surprise came when Imperial reinforcements arrived. Admiral Crathmore brought the Empire's 5th Fleet expecting to crush the human rebellion with overwhelming force. His 15 additional warships dropped out of hyperspace ready for a conventional fleet battle. Instead, he found Admiral Zexthera's forces scattered and demoralized. Half the Imperial ships were drifting helplessly in space, while swarms of human fighters continued their surgical strikes. The other half were trying to retreat, but found their navigation systems compromised by human hackers. "What is the situation?" Crathmore demanded over the communication channels. "The humans have superior numbers and unconventional tactics," Zexthera replied, his voice filled with shame. "They've turned our own technology against us." Crathmore studied the tactical display and felt his confidence evaporate. The humans weren't fighting like any species the Empire had ever encountered. They used tactics that seemed to come from dozens of different military traditions, combining elements that shouldn't work together but somehow did. The turning point came when Dr. Rachel Torres activated her psychological warfare program. The xenopsychologist had spent months analyzing Imperial military culture and had discovered critical weaknesses in their command structure. "Begin broadcasting on all Imperial frequencies," she ordered her team. Suddenly, every Imperial ship received the same transmission. Instead of human propaganda, they heard recordings of their own officers discussing the brutal history of Imperial conquest. Messages that had been intercepted months earlier were now being played back, revealing conversations about enslaving populations and destroying entire civilizations. But more importantly, the broadcasts included communications from species throughout the Empire. Worlds that had been conquered centuries ago were hearing about humanity's resistance and beginning to hope for the first time in generations. Commander Eric Davis led the most daring operation of the battle. His boarding team included hackers, engineers, and cultural specialists, rather than traditional assault troops. Their target was the Imperial flagship itself. "Remember, we're not here to destroy the ship," Eric reminded his team as their stealth transport approached the massive dreadnought. "We're here to capture it and turn it into a broadcasting station." The boarding operation succeeded because Imperial security was designed to repel armed invasions, not infiltration by technical specialists. Eric's team included former civilian contractors who knew how to bypass security systems and computer experts who could reprogram alien technology. Within hours, the Imperial flagship was broadcasting messages across the galaxy. Instead of Imperial propaganda, it transmitted evidence of the Empire's crimes and proof that resistance was possible. The psychological impact was devastating. Species that had been enslaved for centuries suddenly saw hope. Rebellions erupted on dozens of worlds as subject populations realized that the mighty Empire could be defeated. The news of humanity's victory spread faster than Imperial authorities could suppress it. Admiral Zexthera found himself in an impossible position. His fleet was scattered and demoralized. His flagship had been captured and turned against him. Most importantly, his entire understanding of warfare had been proven wrong. "Sir," Sub-Commander Veltar approached hesitantly. "We're receiving surrender terms from the humans." Zexthera read the message with growing amazement. Instead of demanding unconditional surrender or threatening destruction, the humans offered something unprecedented: negotiation. They wanted to talk rather than simply destroy their enemies. "They're offering to discuss terms?" Zexthera asked in disbelief. "Yes, sir. They're proposing a ceasefire and formal negotiations. They say they want to end the fighting without unnecessary bloodshed." For the first time in Imperial history, a conquered species was showing mercy to their former oppressors. The humans had defeated the most powerful military force in the galaxy, but instead of pressing their advantage, they offered peace. Admiral Zexithara stared at the tactical display showing his ruined fleet surrounded by thousands of human fighters. These strange beings had not only defeated him but had done something far more dangerous to the Empire. They had proven that there was an alternative to conquest and domination. The galaxy would never be the same. News of humanity's impossible victory spread across the galaxy faster than Imperial authorities could stop it. On 1,000 different worlds, species that had been enslaved for centuries looked up at the stars with something they had almost forgotten: hope. The mighty Galactic Empire, which had seemed eternal and unstoppable, had been defeated by a species that most had never heard of. Emperor Thraxnal sat in his palace on the Imperial capital world, staring at reports that seemed impossible to believe. For 3,000 years his ancestors had ruled through fear and overwhelming force. No species had ever successfully resisted Imperial conquest. Now he faced something that had never happened in the Empire's long history. He would have to negotiate with equals. Bring me Admiral Zexithara. The Emperor commanded his guards. When the disgraced admiral arrived, his scales were pale with shame. He had lost an entire fleet to primitives who shouldn't have been able to build proper starships, let alone defeat Imperial dreadnoughts. Explain to me how this happened, the Emperor demanded. Zexithara straightened his shoulders and spoke honestly. Your Majesty, we underestimated them completely. They don't fight like any species we've encountered. They turned our own strengths against us and showed mercy when they could have destroyed us. Mercy? The Emperor's voice carried disbelief. Yes, Your Majesty. After defeating our combined fleets, they offered negotiation instead of demanding our surrender. They want to talk, not conquer. The Emperor leaned back in his throne, trying to understand beings who thought so differently from everything he knew. The Empire conquered through strength and ruled through fear. These humans had shown strength but offered friendship. It was beyond his comprehension. Meanwhile, on Earth, Ambassador Victoria Stone prepared for the most important diplomatic mission in human history. The former United Nations negotiator had been chosen to represent humanity in talks with an empire that controlled hundreds of worlds and billions of beings. Are you ready for this? Asked President Martinez during their final briefing. Victoria looked out the window at the stars, knowing that somewhere among them waited representatives of a civilization that had existed for millennia. As ready as anyone can be for something that's never happened before. Her team included military advisors Jake Morrison and Amy Sullivan, along with cultural experts who had studied Imperial society. But Victoria knew that all their preparation might be useless when facing beings whose entire worldview was built on conquest and domination. The peace negotiations took place on a neutral space station that humanity had constructed, specifically for the purpose. The station was a masterpiece of human engineering, designed to accommodate multiple species while demonstrating humanity's technological capabilities. When the Imperial delegation arrived, they expected to find primitives who had gotten lucky in one battle. Instead, they discovered a species that had transformed a star system into a fortress in less than a year and built technologies that the Empire had never imagined. Victoria Stone met Admiral Zexithara in the station's main conference room. The massive Vorthak warrior looked uncomfortable in the diplomatic setting, but his eyes showed something that surprised her: respect. Ambassador Stone, Zexithara said through his translation device, I must admit that your species has challenged every assumption we held about warfare and civilization. Victoria smiled warmly. Admiral, we didn't set out to challenge anything. We simply refused to accept that conquest was the only way species could interact. The negotiations that followed lasted for months and changed both civilizations forever. Humanity didn't want to replace the Empire with their own version of galactic domination. Instead, they proposed something revolutionary: a federation based on voluntary cooperation rather than forced submission. The concept was so alien to Imperial thinking that it took weeks for the delegation to understand what humans were suggesting. Species joining together by choice rather than conquest, worlds contributing to galactic civilization because they wanted to, rather than because they were forced to. It seemed impossible. But as the talks continued, something remarkable happened. Imperial officers who had spent their careers enforcing brutal occupation began to see alternatives they had never considered. Victoria Stone and her team didn't try to humiliate the Empire or demand reparations. Instead, they showed how former enemies could become partners. The breakthrough came when Admiral Zexathera himself asked to visit Earth. The Vorthak warrior had been curious about the world that had produced such unusual beings. What he found changed his understanding of everything. Earth was unlike any world in the Empire. Instead of one dominant species ruling over others, humans shared their planet with millions of different life forms. They had learned to cooperate with nature rather than simply dominating it. Most importantly, they had somehow managed to unite their entire species without conquering each other. How is this possible? Zexathera asked Victoria as they walked through a park in Geneva, where the peace talks were being finalized. It wasn't easy, Victoria admitted. Humans fought each other for thousands of years before we learned that cooperation was stronger than competition. We discovered that diversity makes us stronger, not weaker. The final peace treaty was signed 6 months after the Battle of Earth. The Galactic Empire officially became the Galactic Federation, with membership voluntary and leadership earned through service rather than imposed through force. Hundreds of species that had been enslaved for centuries suddenly found themselves free to choose their own path. But the real transformation was just beginning. Admiral Jake Morrison, now promoted to represent humanity's military, oversaw the integration of human and Imperial forces. The sight of human officers working alongside former enemies sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. The first joint mission was a rescue operation on a world that had been devastated by natural disasters. Human ships worked alongside Imperial vessels to evacuate millions of beings. For many species, it was the first time they had seen their former conquerors acting as protectors rather than oppressors. Years later, the question, "Is that really a human fleet?" had become a joke throughout the galaxy. Human ships were instantly recognizable, not because of their weapons but because of their crews. Wherever humans went, they brought their most powerful export. The idea that former enemies could become friends. Captain Troy Williams stood on the bridge of the starship Unity, watching his mixed crew of humans and aliens work together with perfect coordination. His first officer was a former Imperial admiral. His chief engineer was from a species that had been enslaved for 800 years. His communications officer was Admiral Zexathera's own daughter. When young Ensign Danny Cooper asked how humanity had achieved the impossible, Troy smiled and gave the answer that had become humanity's motto. "We didn't try to be the strongest species in the galaxy, Danny. We just refused to be anything less than human." The Galactic Empire still existed, but it had been transformed into something unrecognizable. A true federation where membership was voluntary and leadership was earned through service. And at the heart of this transformation stood humanity, not as conquerors but as the species that had taught the galaxy that there was a better way to reach for the stars.